Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Going from Good to Great CRM, focused on optimizing user adoption. I'm Martin Schneider with SugarCRM, and I've got with me as our main speaker, Laurence Leong, who is the Vice President of Customer Success at SugarCRM. Laurence, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin, and thanks everyone for attending.
Great. I'm Martin Schneider. I'm a CRM analyst at Sugar, have been with multiple analyst firms as well, been analyzing and working with CRM practitioners and vendors for over 20 years. This presentation will be a collection of what we've learned in hundreds, if not thousands of implementations over the years on how you can ensure great adoption.
So in the rest of this webinar, I'm going to focus on how to drive successful user adoption and what we've learned, as Martin said, over hundreds, if not thousands of CRM projects. And we've boiled it down here into four main elements. I know they can be classified differently, but I'm going to talk here about four main elements. So the first one is well-defined business objectives. Second one is making sure you have really good stakeholder representation, or what we've described as build your team. The third is a big one, which is any CRM project we think is a project in change management.
Absolutely.
And then the last one is measure, report, iterate, adjust. So let me talk a little bit about each one of those. If you go to the next slide. In terms of well-defined business objectives, we think it starts with, and this really is good governance overall, but clearly articulating business objectives for the project and for the deployment. So you don't want there to be confusion among what are the goals of the project, and make sure that there's a rigorous project plan behind those objectives. And on my last point here on this slide, it's okay to phase these objectives in the plan, right? CRM typically tends to be a journey, not a destination. In fact, Martin, if you click once, we've worked with, one more time, we've worked with a number of analysts, including Gartner and others, and they've developed a CRM maturity model that basically talks about going from kind of no CRM typically and a lot of ad hoc stuff to repeatable processes to then measurable and then fully optimized CRM. And however you, wherever you are on that journey, I think it's important to be able to say, for this next rollout of your CRM that you're going to see in, let's just say, December. So maybe there's a phase rolling in December. And so you say, in December, our goals are going to be X, and we'll have a future phase potentially next year, but be clear on what your objectives are. So if you click one more time, Martin, one example could be that our business objectives are, in December of this year, what we're going to call phase one, we're going to reduce our costs by 10% by removing manual spreadsheet forecasting, just to pick one example.
I like that. That's a great example, because when you think of the kind of moving to the right as dates moving forward and moving up is the benefits you get, rather than saying we're going to add a feature or we're going to add a tool, it's really the benefit. So everyone sees their benefit in mind. It's not about forcing people, in their minds, oh, I got to use this new thing or I got to change it. Good things are going to come, and putting it that way, I think, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and then piggybacking on that, I talked about the users, and I think a key follow-on from the idea of having clear business objectives. So using that example of the 10%, if you click again, Martin, it's also important to translate that to the individual users. So if I use that example of we're going to reduce our cost 10% by eliminating manual forecasting, what might that mean for a salesperson? And some of the examples could be what's shown here. So for phase one in December, Joe and Mary salesperson, you are no longer going to need to manually type and send forecast spreadsheets every week. You can update your sales opportunities in real time. Managers and colleagues are no longer going to email you. They can look in the CRM. And Joe and Mary, typically we've seen that will save you 4 to 5 hours a week, right? And that's what's in it for you that follows from the business objectives. So that would be an example of describing what's in it for users. And the next point, and I'll give you some examples of this a little later on, we encourage our customers to think about marketing that internally. That's an internal marketing campaign that you should think of, in fact, conceptually no different than how you might do an external campaign. You got a talk track and messaging. Maybe this is the messaging. And then as you go out and evangelize that within your company, you're always sticking to that talk track. In fact, and I'll get into this a little later on, I've actually seen companies develop those talk tracks, and the CEO and the VP of sales and the VP of sales ops and the director of IT, they all talk off of that talk track and market and message this internally.
It's really important that you note that. I mean, how much is done in kind of an internal comms, in plain English, benefits focused, and it's not a inside the system technical configuration we're talking about at all right now.
Right.
You know, it's really important to articulate that.
Yeah. And then the last point I've got here, and I touched on this earlier, again, if you stick with my example of that, you know, hey, company, internally, our goal for December is to reduce cost by 10%. And that helps set the right expectation. There might be a lot of other things that the company wants to do. If you think of my maturity model, right, that might be your first step, and then you might have future steps later on. We're going to do additional automation, or we're going to tie it to marketing automation, or whatever it is. So I think it's also important as you communicate internally to the users to say, look, we're focusing on this in December in phase 1, and maybe we're targeting these other things for phase 2. Maybe we have less clarity around exactly what's in phase 2, but know that we're still planning a phase 2. So that just really helps set expectations correctly. All right, let's keep going then. So that was number 1. Number 2 is build a team. And so what we generally recommend is you need to make sure you have stakeholder representation from kind of all the different folks that are involved, or you know, the stakeholders. We do see some CRM deployments where they're owned solely by IT, and you know what we've generally found is that is not really a recipe for success. So you need to make sure you have the right stakeholders. You have an executive line of business sponsor in a sales automation use case that typically might be a sales leader, right, an SVP of sales. If it's a service use case, could be SVP service. And then sometimes, and this depends on the size of the company and kind of the complexity of the deployment, but you might have a program owner that's a sales ops leader as well. You might have an IT sponsor, you know, VP or director of IT. And then this last piece is really key. We also recommend that you think about, you know, it's great to have the SVP of sales, but that person is not the same person that's quote unquote on the floor or the person on the street, right? So think about how do you have representation from at the grassroots level, if you will. And here we recommend that you think about a mix of what I call the spiritual leader on the floor. Who's the go-to salesperson? There may not be a manager, but they're kind of the person that everybody goes to for questions, right? Maybe a very experienced person. So that's a good person to have as part of the team. Another one is, who is somebody that's a complainer? And to kind of mitigate the complainer, and actually the complainer might have good feedback, have them be part of the team, right? Another one is the power user. For example, some of our customers look at who has created the most opportunities. And that would be a good person to have involved because they just do a lot of this. And then, you know, typically we see a lot of use cases that also involve approvals, right? I'm putting opportunities in the system, but those have to go to a manager or maybe a sales ops desk or a deal desk for approval. So that sequence of steps for the approval is an important sequence of steps. So make sure you have a manager or approver in there as well. And I think if you look on the right-hand side of this chart, the purpose of getting this user mix is really 2 reasons. One is that you actually want feedback from those users ahead of time, right? Maybe you involve them in some of the mock-ups and the system design, and then I would definitely recommend those are the folks that should get involved in the user acceptance testing. So they're actually giving you feedback. You don't have to answer all the feedback and necessarily solve it in phase 1. You can say, that's great feedback, and we're going to take that for phase 2, but you want that feedback. And the second thing, if you go back to what I said earlier, I talked kind of about it, internal evangelism. So these users, if you do it right, they should actually become your ambassadors, right? We've had some customers that say, when this thing goes to roll out to the company, it's not the program owner that pitches it, or it's not the sales leader that pitches it. It's John, the sales rep, and Mary, the sales rep. These are your peers, right? So to the sales team, hey, I can tell you about it, but you're going to hear from your own peer, one of you, right, John or Mary, as opposed to, then that gets you out of kind of the us versus them, right? And then set up a governance schedule, whether it's every month or every quarter. Our most successful customers gather these stakeholders. They make sure they run the plans by them for phase one as you're starting to plan it, maybe the initial design or use cases, definitely during the testing phase and kind of user acceptance prior to rollout. So you want thorough stakeholder involvement well before and as well as after you do your rollout. And then the last point is make sure it's a closed loop process, right? Ensure users feel their feedback is heard, get their input. Again, as I said, it might go into phase two, but you have to make sure that the users feel like they're being heard. All right, so let's move on then to the third item out of our four, and that's change management. And the way we think of this is any CRM deployment is a change management project. And I'm not talking so much about, sure, there's the project management of deploying the system and all the design and testing and so forth. So you absolutely have to do that. But I'm more talking here about have you have you thought about how you're going to manage the change in the users? Again, remember, this affects fundamentally how they work, day to day and minute by minute, right? So when we think of user communication, and I'll show you an example of how one of our customers did this a little bit later on, think of maybe 3 phases. Awareness, so are we starting to prep users ahead of time that, hey, we've got some exciting changes coming that you're going to start seeing, right? So that's an example of awareness. Readiness, which is, all right, now that we've prepared you that something's coming, here's what you have to start doing to be ready. You might have to take education, right? You might have to be aware that you have to maybe clean up your opportunities or eliminate duplicate data. What do you have to do as a user to get ready? And then clearly there's the deployment phase. Now we're going to go live. And then post-deployment, what's going to happen, right? Give your feedback. Again, we've got maybe a SWAT team to answer questions, to help you, as well as to hear feedback, and then report back. Here's what we're doing with your feedback. So again, make sure they're feeling that they're heard. Consider both what I call the carrot and stick, right? Here's what's in it for you is the carrot. It's going to save you work. It's going to make your life easier, whatever it is. But you also might need a little bit of the stick approach, which is, you just have to do this for all sales opportunities going forward. You're not going to get a sales consultant assigned without a valid opportunity, right? In a sales use case, I've heard people say things like, it doesn't exist if it's not in the CRM. So those are examples where you also need that. You need to push that down from the top down. Appeal to both the heart and brain, right? And this is any change management fundamental. People will tell you the logic, the fact that it's saving you work is important, but at its heart, a lot of this is not necessarily logic. It's whether people like it. Do they have a good feeling about it? And that's why just kind of making sure that they feel heard is important. And I described this earlier, treat it as an internal marketing program, define actual internal messaging. What's the messaging to the users? What's the messaging to the first-line managers? You need the first-line managers to also support it. They might have a slightly different, there might be a different talk track to the first-line managers than to the actual users. And the last thing, we get asked a lot about change management, and one of the things we say, and later on I'll give you some examples of things our customers have done, but ultimately it comes down to how does your organization handle change management and rolling out things? What works best for your team, right? Do you like to go around and do road shows? Do you do webinars? Do you like gamification, right? Some of our customers think of a cool new project name, right? And then they print up T-shirts and hats, and they give out prizes, or they do lunch and learns. It's just kind of culturally what works for you and your team and your organization. I'll give you some examples of what different customers have done, but it's up to how you do that in your own company.
And I imagine size, scope, when we do a global deployment with some of the largest companies in the world, they're putting out all the stops, right? These are critical things. But some of our mid-sized customers are probably doing a little bit less, maybe more around a lot of communication and face-to-face and being able to do that if they're in a single building, in a single campus, right? Thing it's pretty simple to do, right? Keep it a little more simple, a little more benefits focused, a little more communication, right?
Yep, exactly. For a small company, I think the same concepts apply, but yeah, it might be an announcement early on to make them aware. Here's what you have to do to get ready, and then literally it might be an all hands lunch and learn in the in the lunchroom.
Literally bulletin board reminders, right?
Yeah,
Text stuff,
exactly.
Right? Yeah, whatever works, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Whatever works. All right, so let's go to the last one. Oh, so actually a little bit more on change management. Here are just some ideas in terms of what other customers have done. Right? Give the program a cool, fun new name, Project Voltron or something like that. Brand it, right? Have a logo and build some excitement around it. Identify the right communication channels, right? Is it a web posting on the company thing? Is it literally a bulletin board, right? Have listening sessions. Gather users together. Maybe have your ambassadors be in charge of, hey, go out to your peers and ask them. Create an internal comms. In fact, one of our customers, they don't call it user adoption, they called it user excitement, and I love that. That's what you're trying to do is you're trying to get them excited about it, right? Establish a champions program. After rollout, this person was the best in terms of adopting the new system and taking advantage of things. We already talked about creating a governance board. Create an intranet site where not only do you put education materials, but hey, if you have feedback, put it here. Right, have a go live SWAT team to make sure that in those critical days after go live, you've got somebody, somebody is right there to answer questions and help you. Right, customize training materials for you. I'll actually give you examples of, and for Sugar customers, we have a lot of Sugar not only training but marketing materials, and I'll show you examples of that. But you are free to take that content and actually repurpose that, and some of our customers have done that. As I mentioned, your early users should be both feedback as well as then once you go live, put them on stage. Don't have you be on stage, right? Have them be the ambassadors. If your company likes gamification, people always love that. Contests, prizes, right? All that stuff. Poll users afterwards. In larger companies, we've actually seen them have an executive enablement kit, right? Go to all the geography sales leaders and say, this is the talk track, and actually give them a messaging sheet. Again, going back to my point of it's like an internal marketing campaign. Define success metrics, right? It's important to be able to say, for phase one, we were trying to do this, and then report back. We actually got here, we were close, we hit it, we achieved it, report back on that. It's kind of an obvious one, but don't underestimate, celebrate the launch event, right? And trot out maybe some of your ambassadors. Have them, we've seen other customers where they do internal testimonials. Here's, John, the salesperson, and this is what he said about how it saved him time and he loved the system. We did, make a video of that or write up a short write-up around that and make that a post-go live user testimonial. So these are all examples that our customers have used that you can use as you think about your own change management. All right, and then the last thing is, again, think of it as a journey, not a destination. So everything I just described might lead up to, phase one or phase X. And then going forward, we recommend to our customers that they do a couple things. One is monitor adoption and usage. And we can actually, from a Sugar perspective, we can actually give you data on what your user activity is, not just user login, but we actually have very exciting new usage metrics that lets us report to you things like the number of opportunities created or modified in the last 30 days, the number of cases in a service use case created and modified in the last 30 days, number of campaigns in a marketing use case created and modified in the last 30 days. A lot of our customers, or some of the customers that we work with, and in general what I see in the industry is, if you're a CRM program owner, do you actually know what the usage adoption is? And in some cases, some CRM program owners or CRM admins don't know. And so if that's your case, I would encourage you, work with us, work with your SugarCRM customer success rep, and they can actually give you a report that shows you what that user activity actually is. And that gives you some hard data on what the user adoption actually is out in your system. And those of you, something else I'd recommend there is you may be running your own reports, but that definitely is a best practice, which is if you're a program owner, you should be monitoring the actual usage based on metrics. And then you can adjust accordingly, right? And then the next point here is collect user feedback. I already talked about that, right? Get their feedback, use the positive feedback as an internal testimonial, take the negative feedback and address it. And it's very important, I think, in any kind of user adoption to make sure you have that closed loop. Celebrate successes, adjust as needed, right? And again, this could be a message of congratulations, we've completed phase 1, we wanted 10% cost reduction and we got there. Now phase 2 is going to be, tying it to marketing automation, just as an example. And so these are going to be our goals. So kind of build that cadence of setting the right expectation, celebrating that we met those expectations, and then adjusting. We're taking your feedback and we're putting them into phase 2. And again, it's a journey, not a destination. So a couple thoughts to segue off that last point, which is we recognize many of you, and in the poll results, right, 67% of you said your CRM was implemented over a year ago. So the same concepts apply to existing implementations, but obviously you're not rolling out a new system. So for existing implementations, I think keep the same concepts in mind, but think about whether you need to evaluate, kind of do a thorough evaluation of the current system, right? Have you looked at usage metrics on your current system? What is the user adoption like on your current system? You can also go out and interview users. We have the ability at Sugar to help you with what we call a health check or maybe even a usability workshop, right? Hey, your users are really not the way the system is implemented. Maybe they're struggling with a certain usability element, and we can help with that. And then based on that, I would recommend you think about, do you need to just tweak, right? Is your message kind of an incremental, in general, we're doing pretty well in terms of the system and user adoption, and hey, the users have told us they generally like it, but we know we need to make some improvements, and here's what we're going to do in the next phase. So that's what I would call a tweak. And I would still encourage you to think of that you still want to adhere to the best practices I just described, but it's kind of slimmed down. Versus, right, and in some cases, it may be completely appropriate to say, you know what, we really need to do a relaunch, right? Now, here, an example of one customer that did this was they rolled out a desktop implementation, and then they found what their users really wanted was mobile. So we actually worked with them, kind of rejigged and did a significant mobile rollout, and they actually relaunched and said, hey users, we've listened to you. We know you didn't like the desktop only or when that was less useful. Now we have this great new, it was like, 2.0, right? Full mobile, we listened to what you wanted, and they loved it. And user adoption, which had been struggling before, significantly increased. And in that case, again, they did a full-blown awareness, readiness, go live and post-deployment, but they really treated that as a relaunch. And if that's where you are, that's okay, right? It's a good way to actually turn kind of a maybe poor user adoption situation into a better one.
And the great thing about that is you don't have to go through the rigorous process of reevaluation, reconfiguration, renegotiation. It's all you've got, especially with sugar. All that stuff is available with no real additional cost other than a little bit of the labor to reconfigure in mobile, and then you're out. So you're saving months, if not maybe years, depending on the scope, and possibly thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on scope doing that. So relaunch sounds scary, but it can actually be the best thing sometimes.
Yep, that's exactly right. And in the case of the customer I was mentioning, they didn't rip out and re-implement their entire system.
Yeah.
With Martin, to your point, it was really more they did do some mobile development, and we helped them with that. But then it was really focused on kind of the marketing and the perception
the marketing
of the
activity,
users, right? Of now we have this great new mobile.
Cool.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so let's go to the next slide.
All right. This is always my favorite part. We talk a lot of theory. It's always, and we have tons of lists of things, and I'm sure people are looking and saying, that's a lot of things. How do we get all that in play in a 6-month rollout, or even a 90-day rollout for some of our smart companies? You go live pretty quickly, or some people are doing maybe long rollouts. How do we keep all this organized? So you're going to give us an adoption story, an implementation case study. Tell us a bit more about who this is and the scope and all that, so we kind of know what we're dealing with.
Yep, perfect. So let's go to the next slide. So this is an actual case study, and as Martin said, I know I threw a lot of stuff at you, but hopefully to maybe cement it, I'll give you an actual example of just one of the many customers that we worked with on user adoption. So this was a large food services company. They were doing a new rollout of sugar, and their rollout was focused on their North American sales team. It was 500 users. It was a 5-month implementation timeline. But what was really interesting is they, to their credit, I think, fully recognized that user adoption was going to be critical in their success. And in fact, before they even signed the contract with us, they went through their selection process. They selected sugar, but then they actually said, well, wait a minute, let's make sure we work with sugar to have a full-blown user adoption plan so that we make sure we're successful. And they actually did that before they even signed the contract with us. And so we actually came in and helped them with that user adoption. So they ran a user adoption program, they project management. I'll actually show you some examples of that project timeline. And they managed it equally to how they managed the implementation project timeline, right? So one of the key messages I would leave with the audience here is, kind of pay as much attention to the user adoption project plan as you do to the implementation project plan. They followed our recommendation for the 3-stage adoption strategy, so you'll actually see an awareness phase in their project plan, a readiness phase, a post-deployment phase. And they successfully launched to all users in 3 phases in 6 weeks. So it was a good success story.
That's great.
So if we go to the next slide, you'll actually see some of the examples of the detail behind how we built this with them. And I won't walk through kind of every single thing here, but you can see in awareness, right? They did a lot of, hey, this is going to be coming. They engaged executive leadership. They communicated the business benefits. They set expectations, all the stuff I talked about earlier, right? Then they did a readiness campaign where they actually said, here's what you have to do to get ready, salesperson, right? They ensured that had a requirements checklist of here's what you have to do ready prior to launch. They did a lot of education. So education is definitely a key piece of any user adoption strategy. But the thing I would stress is it's not just education. And I would also say, said differently, I would say if your user adoption plan is just education, you might be missing things, right? Education on the tool is good, but there's a lot more to it than just education. They did build out, this particular customer built out ambassadors and champions, right? And then post-deployment, they looked at and worked with us to monitor adoption metrics. They started thinking about what was going to be coming in the next phase. They had a closed loop process in terms of, hey, we're listening to your feedback. They absolutely celebrated the benefits of the new system. And then, their leadership, sales leadership, pushed it down, right? Hey, everything has to be in the new system. It just, for the company's benefit, it has to work that way. And that was pushed down as well. So that's an example there. I mentioned a project plan, so they actually managed it as a rigorous project, right? And we actually helped them with that. But you know, this now is just kind of basic project management 101. We go to the next slide. I talked about building out a talk track. So this is actually a slide that we helped them build, which says this is the internal talk track. And again, if anybody's in marketing, this is what you would do for a product launch externally. They did this internally, right? Here is the benefits of doing this. Here's why it's important to the company. Here's what's in it for you. And here's how we're going to talk about it. And then if you click again, they actually built out a messaging slide and used that internally as they did all hands meetings or sales meetings, and they cascaded that down through sales leadership. Okay? So again, it's really an internal marketing campaign. If you're a smaller company, it doesn't have to be as complicated and robust as this, but I think the same principles apply. So let's go to the next slide. I talked a little bit about assets. This particular company is actually interesting. They did as well a series of videos for their users. Their company likes videos, and so they shot videos on this new project. And just as a testament to how well they viewed that they worked with us, our customer success representative who actually worked with them on the video was actually featured in the video, which I took as, you know, not many customers put vendors in their own internal videos, but we had worked so closely together that they actually did that. And so what I'm showing you on this slide is we have our own Sugar marketing videos, right? And this is just a screenshot of that. You can get it from that URL. But to our customers, you're free to take our videos and reuse them, which is something people have done. It might be an easy way, you know, again, bigger companies might want to shoot their own videos. Smaller companies, you might want to just reuse our videos. Click again, Martin. We also have infographics. Again, this is a manufacturing infographic, just as one example. So again, feel free to take our materials and use them and leverage them to do your own internal marketing and messaging. So with that, let's go to the next slide and start to move into the wrap-up.
All right, let's wrap it all up.
Yeah, and so I'll summarize what I talked about here. User adoption is critical. Not done well, it can frankly cause, you know, a CRM project to fail or not be successful. And conversely, doing a good job of that, and none of what I described I think is rocket science. Doing a good job of that helps drive success for your CRM project. I talked about 4 main elements: making sure you have well-defined business objectives. You should have that anyway. That's just good project governance. But then also translating that into what's in it for the users, right? The second thing is build your team. Make sure you have stakeholder representation. Make sure you have user representation from the line of business, but also think about, quote unquote, the people on the street or the people on the floor, right? Not just the executives, but the actual users. And think about the spiritual leader, the complainer, all of those different folks, and think about them as both giving you feedback as well as they become your ambassadors. Make sure you adhere to change management principles. Prepare the users, this is coming. Then readiness, what do they have to do to get ready? And then make sure you handhold them, through go live, and then post deployment, make sure it's a closed loop process. So just change management best practices. And then the last thing is, I've said multiple times, it's a journey, not a destination. So keep iterating and make sure the users are involved in that iteration loop. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about before we switch over to questions is how can we help you, right? And I'm the Vice President of Customer Success. I have a team of customer success representatives. So all SugarCRM customers have a customer success representative, and our job is to ensure your success. That's our #1 focus. We're not trying to sell you things. Our job is to make you successful, because frankly, if you're not successful, then we are not successful. And part of our job, I mentioned it in the case of that customer case study, is our customer success representative worked intimately with the customer on defining and executing that user adoption plan. And we can do that, right? We can help you define a user adoption plan. Ultimately, how you do it really depends on what works at your company, but we can give you guidance. We can provide you with usage metrics. We typically recommend and are happy to participate in a governance meeting. I mentioned building the team and having those stakeholders and having whether you call it a governance meeting or a steering committee meeting. We are happy to participate in that and would actually recommend that together with, if you use a deployment partner. Again, we'd actually recommend a three-way meeting between your stakeholders, your deployment partner, and Sugar. And in that, we can kind of think of us as that's the board of directors, if you will, for your Sugar deployment, right? I talked about marketing materials. We can help provide you with those marketing materials that then you can reuse. And then one of our main jobs, quite frankly, is to be your quarterback or your coordinator for SugarCRM resources. We can help funnel you and help with support if you need to use Sugar support resources. We do have resources to do things like a health check or a usability workshop, and the SugarCRM customer success rep, their job is to be your point of contact into those resources. So I'm going to stop there. Martin, I'll let you maybe wrap up, and then we can move into questions and answers.
Sure thing, sure thing. So, thank you guys. If the questions are coming through, if you have any, please put them in the questions box there, and we'll get to them. If we don't get to all the questions, we will certainly follow up with you via email. As noted in the poll, we had about 25% of you, I think it was 60-some%, as Laurence said, have been in a multi-year rollout. Only about 9 or 10% are active, but about 1 in 4 of you guys were about going into about a year or so. And I think that makes sense for this first question is, and I'll let you answer this one, Laurence, is, how do we know if we're getting poor adoption before it's too late to do anything? So what's an early indicator? What are things that you can do in that regard?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the first thing I would say is make sure you have some way to measure usage like the usage metrics I mentioned. If you don't, we can help you with that. But I would definitely say you want to have some sort of metrics that tells you what the user login is, or even better yet, opportunities created and modified, cases created and modified, as I mentioned. And that actually is that's almost like a real-time indicator that tells you how users are using the system. If you see that dramatically tail off, that's a warning sign. And another warning sign is if you see just low user adoption relative to what your goals are, or kind of what your license count is. A simple metric we look at within Sugar is if you have 100 licenses and you have less than, let's say, 80% usage, you have less than 80 users logging in general, that's not a good sign. So that's kind of just a rough rule of thumb I would put out to you. You might have your own separate rules. But so that would be the first starting point. And then if you see that it's either low or it's dropping off, then it becomes, why is that, right? Is it because there's actual problems with the system, data problems, usability problems? Is it that the users need training? It's hard to know that for sure, but in that case, I would actually go out and kind of poll your user stakeholder community and try to find that out. Okay? Great.
We one other quick question which keeps coming up is, will you have these slides available for us? We will both have a replay if you weren't able to catch all of the webinar today. We'll be sending it out to all registrants, and we'll also make a PDF version of these slides together, and we'll send them out as well with the replay link. Another question for you, Laurence, is you mentioned relaunch. does that typically mean that we would stop, or can we do that in parallel without having a break in access to CRM? Meaning, I guess they mean, obviously you're going to keep using the system, right? Is that what they're saying? Is I think people think of relaunch as, oh, we're going to stop and then go again. I mean, there should be continuity across the whole board, right?
Yeah, and when I used relaunch, and maybe that was, I gave the wrong impression. Most customers that we've seen, they don't stop using it. It continues, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But then they just essentially do either they add on new capabilities, or they switch their focus, like the customer I mentioned, to mobile, to a new area of it. So it doesn't mean you have to stop using the older system. It's just that from a marketing perspective, you say, here's version 2.0 of our CRM, and we've got significant new capabilities like mobile.
Mm-hmm. Great. One more question that we have in here is, I'm not the project manager, but how do I sell to the project manager that changes need to be made? How do I let them know? I guess the question is, a lot of times, from the vendor side, we only know by talking to our contacts, which are typically people who are managing the project. If they don't know that there's issues, how have you seen it kind of boil up, and what's a good way for people to communicate that without it seeming like they're just complaining, right?
Yeah.
What have you seen? What's the kind of best practices there?
Yeah, and that's before I answer that I hear that quite commonly as well, where I've worked with a number of customers where, say, the CRM owner or an IT owner owns the CRM, and then they hear a message like this, and they say, oh, this message really needs to be heard by my sales leadership, mm-hmm. And they need to get bought in before we go any further. So that I've heard that before. That's not uncommon. And in that case, I would just say, point them to these kinds of materials. We can get on the phone with them, and I've done that before as well, where, and frankly, the message and by we I mean Sugar, right, we would deliver is, and we have no problem, say, getting in front of the stakeholder leadership and saying, hey, for this project to be successful, this is what we would recommend. We would recommend that the leadership support it and, frankly, push it, but also institute these kinds of best practices. And the last thing I would say is, I would also, be telling them it's not just Sugar's message. A lot of these are industry best practices for CRM. So it's just, this is an industry best practice, and I would just highlight that.
Gotcha. One, I think we're talking about one more. It's, it really asks around, it's kind of a longer question, so I just want to get to the meat of it, is, what's the Sugar team's role in needs analysis, requirements gathering? I think it's talking about the pre-deployment. How involved can we be to ensure there's adoption, I think? Because we talk about the business plan around adoption, but how involved can the customer success team be, or call it our pre-sales be, in making sure that they phase correctly, not just in adoption, but I guess also in scoping?
Yeah. So in general, what I would say is the customer success team should be involved, earlier than we typically are, or put differently, where we've seen our most successful customers, as in the case of the case study I talked about, is where customer success was involved and user adoption was being thoroughly discussed and worked on, even before the deal closed, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. So I kind of think that is a good best practice, because you want to start thinking about this early and working on this early. So that's one thing I would definitely encourage, and I've been telling my own team that, quite frankly, is we do want to get involved early, and to have as smooth a handover as possible from, quote unquote, the new sales phase to start to think about all of these kind of post-sales items like user adoption.
Great. One more quick one. What do you recommend in terms of user training to encourage adoption? Where does that fall? You know, I always say early and often, but what's your take on that? I mean, what kind of, in one of those phases that we talked about in the 3-phase process, where does training take the biggest chunk there?
Yeah, good question. And this is to answer that, I might, you know, we've probably all had the experience of, hey, Laurence, this is mandatory training. You gotta take it by the end of this month, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the way I'd answer the question is, you got to give them a reason to do the training before you make them do the training, right? And so this is why we think of awareness, right? So the awareness is, here's what we're doing and why it's important to the company and you. Give them a reason why, and then I think the training follows from that. But I wouldn't. This is why I cautioned against your user adoption program shouldn't just be training, because if you haven't done what we call the awareness phase of why is it important to you and why is it important to the company, then it's just a mandatory training course that they're going to take, and they may not even know why, right? So definitely, don't get me wrong, training is important, but I wouldn't do it before I did the awareness phase. I would do the awareness, then I would do the training. Another point I would make is I wouldn't do the training too far in advance of go live, because then people forget it. And then, you know, make sure you sequence it that way: awareness, readiness, and then, you know, deployment and post deployment.
Gotcha. And one last one, I think this will be our last one given time. If our usage has been dropping over time but not completely, how can we reignite usage and adoption? I think that's the thing that people get into a lot, is they go live and that they think the system's, I don't want to say done, they take the destination, not the journey approach. What are some things that people can do to maybe to reevaluate that?
Yeah, great question. And there I would say, listen to the users, right? Go get, it's hard for me to answer in a blanket answer that covers all scenarios, and because the answer might be you have data issues, or you have usability issues, or they want mobile instead of desktop. It could be any number of things, right? Or it could just be they don't have enough training. So it's really hard to know that. The one blanket answer I will give is go out and survey them and look at usage metrics. That will give you one data point, and then go ask them and try to get a pulse of what is the user sentiment. If they're not using it, why? And then your action plan really depends on the why.
That's great. I think, yeah, a lot of times people think, oh, maybe we need to change the system, but really it's a lot of communication. I think at the end of all this, it's a lot of internal communication. It's a lot of marketing your benefits internally and really doing a lot of that work diligently, really, across the board.